Good afternoon, Birmingham, and indeed good afternoon to everyone watching, I hope, around the world. So I know you've had lots of wonderful members of the local community showing the talent that there is in this place over the course of the day. I'm going to tell a bit of our story about what I think is important in our story of economic revival. So let's have a little look then. The West Midlands, those of you in the room probably know this, but others might not, so I need to explain where we are. We're at the heart of Britain. The West Midlands is about 3 million people, 7 boroughs coloured orange in that map, and Britain's second city, from where we are doing this broadcast, is right at the heart of the West Midlands, Birmingham, of course. And if you looked at our economy, it would be about the size of a small, middle-sized European country. And we've got a wonderful history. This is, in a sense, where the whole modern economy started. It's the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution. The image on the screen behind me is of the Thomas Dudley coalfields in Dudley, in the Black Country. And of course, the place got the name the Black Country because all of the chimneys, the foundries, whatever, belched out the smoke and the soot. And it was literally a black place with that soot. And it was said in history that Queen Victoria, when she travelled through the Black Country by train, she would close the curtain on her train window so she did not have to see the pollution in the atmosphere. But of course, industry made this place an incredibly wealthy place. That fire and brimstone, that was the way in which wealth was made in the 19th century. And you see it in the architecture of the place, some of the images on the screen there have been lost, but many are still here today. And the architects sort of made the statement of affluence, particularly our civic buildings, but also, of course, the private buildings of those industrialists. So they were good times. And indeed, in the 1960s, this place was the richest city in Britain. People were paid more here than in London. Unthinkable now. And British government policy in the 60s was actually to sort of dampen down the economy of Birmingham and the West Midlands, to move businesses away actively so that this place did not overheat. They were good days, but sadly, they didn't last. With the deindustrialisation came the loss of jobs. And this simple graph shows the job situation in the rest of the country, the top line, against Birmingham, the bottom line. And you see that we did badly, not just for a few years, but for 40 years. So for a long time, we underperformed. And in fact, we moved from having the best pay rates in Britain to the time we got to the 2010 general election to having the highest unemployment anywhere in Britain. So from great success to a proud Brummie like me still has to say, some failure. And that hurt. You saw it in the social problems. And others saw it and wrote about it. This was the Economist magazine, an article I hated. It said, Birmingham, second city, second class. The date, 2012. They were writing about our demise. And I remember at the time trying to persuade them it was unfair, they shouldn't publish this, but they were having none of it. The Economist said, that's what the data says, that's what we're writing. And they did. And you had to ask yourself at that time, I was lucky. I was working for another company. I'd been brought up here, but then when I was 18, I went off to university, and then I went into work for John Lewis. And many of you will know John Lewis, Britain's most successful workers' cooperative, big department store group. But I wasn't here, but I was looking at it from afar saying, how is it that my home city has so declined from what we knew before? And you saw the origins of it. When I was a child growing up, you could see the factories closing, you could see the derelict spaces, but you stood back and you said, what's lain behind it? And I thought there were 4 things that had lain behind them. And I do just want to go through them because I think they tell us something, not just about Birmingham and the West Midlands, but something that's much more widely applicable. The first problem was that we'd been too dependent on traditional industries. This image is the inside of the old MG Rover factory at Longbridge in South Birmingham. When I was a child, it was the biggest factory in Britain. Employed about 40,000 people. Went bust in 2005. It's now begun to come back to life, but that was a huge shock when that went. And we were too dependent on those traditional industries. And alongside that, we'd been dependent on them for training people. So actually, we'd not developed the skills for new industries. And this is probably the most damning slide of all. This looks at various places across the country and looks at the skills of our workforce. And in 2007, we were the worst qualified workforce of anywhere in Britain. A real correlation with our economic performance, the worst qualified. And then there was question of leadership. There was nobody who was shouting up for a place like this. The image is of a very famous chap, Mayor Joe Chamberlain. He was mayor of this city back in 1870. He was a wonderful champion. He fought for us, but he was a figure of history. And what had happened is Britain had become much more centralised. Power had been taken away from places like this. There was nobody really shouting up for us. And it was illustrated by the fact that David Cameron said to me, he was Prime Minister in 2010, he said to me, you know what, Andy, when I want to talk to London, I talk to Boris Johnson. He was then Mayor of London. But when I want to talk to the West Midlands, I don't have one individual I want to talk to. And then, equally damning, the country had put all of its resources into London. This graph shows the relative spending on transport and infrastructure per head between London, the big blue chart, and everywhere else. So no surprise that if we invested in wonderful transport in London and not done so in the West Midlands, you've got an internationally competitive city in London, and other places had been a bit left behind, if I can use that political phrase. And is it right that Londoners have twice, thrice, 4 times, 5 times as much investment as other parts of the country? It's not. And just to exemplify it, this little map shows how this was so damaging to us internationally. This shows the metro systems, West Midlands on the right, and then Lyon, France's second city, on the left. The story is clear. They'd got on and invested. We'd not. And there's lots of academic research written about how this meant that this region, and it was the same in Leeds, in Nottingham, maybe other cities, had just not moved forward with the same investment. And we were not productive in the same way as those cities were. You just think about it. If you're in one of the tough, poor communities away from the city centre, how do you move in for the jobs that are available? So, I stood back from it all and I said there's 4 ingredients that are causing this relative failure. We've been too reliant on the historical industries, we've not trained our workforce for the new ones, nobody's shouting up, and we haven't invested in our infrastructure. We've got an unbalanced country as a result. 2010, the incoming coalition government led by David Cameron and George Osborne, they understood and they saw that. And they began to talk about rebalancing the economy, actually getting ahead in these regional areas, not being totally dependent on London. And the first thing they did, and it's a bit technical this, but it's my story, they asked business people, and I was then Chief Executive of John Lewis, to step forward and lead what were called local enterprise partnerships around the country. And the local enterprise partnership brought together businesses, the councils and academics, the universities, to try to drive forward the economies of our regions. And I said, yeah, I'll go back to my home city in 2011 and will lead that institution there. And that's what I did. Roll the clock forward to 2015, and that rebalancing was just beginning to work. And the government said we can go a step further. We can learn from what happens in America, in France, in Germany, in Japan, and we're going to have directly elected mayors around the country. A single person who's accountable for the performance of these places. And they began to look for people to stand for these jobs. I said I'd stand. It was a political appointment. It is a political appointment. Whether it should be is another matter. But for certain, it's directly elected by the people, and you are accountable to the people. The map shows the areas of the country that chose to go for this, coloured in green, and the populations. The West Midlands, we went for it, 2.8 million people. The first election was in May 17, and I just won that election. So I gave up business and moved into this role. And the agenda was clear. If the things that had let us down were, as we said, the agenda going forward was to address those things. Create a more diverse economy. Create a better skilled workforce. Find a voice, champion, get investment in that critical infrastructure. So that's what we set about doing. We being really important. A team. We came together, formed a leadership team for the region. The first thing, of course, was to have a plan. And I'm sorry, there's a lot of information on that slide. But the idea is simple. What were the economic sectors that we were going to be brilliant at in the future? Let's not just look back, but let's think what we're going to be brilliant at. And when I say brilliant, I don't mean against Manchester and Leeds and Liverpool. I do mean against Boston and Barcelona and Beijing. How was this place going to be superb competitively internationally? And we talked about the sectors that we would invest in. So of course it was advanced manufacturing, but there's new things like life sciences. There's new things like the green tech that's going to power the answer to climate change. There's new things like fintech as well. So we got our sectors. Then we had to think about training people, getting them the skills they needed. The image there is a chap who joined one of our schemes. It was called Construction Gateway, to get a new career in construction. So we've done that in construction. We've done it in digital, the sectors that are growing the fastest. And lo and behold, over the years, and you see this goes back to that 20% unqualified level, year by year, we've reduced the proportion of our total workforce with limited skills. And now we're no longer the sick man of Britain in that respect. And I think that will determine our future success, the progress that we've made there. And then we also had to have the champions, the people to speak up. And the image there is obviously myself, Andy Burnham, Mayor of Greater Manchester, elected at the same time, and Mayor Sadiq Khan of London, with the woman on the right-hand side, is his deputy mayor, or one of his deputy mayors. And we see ourselves as the sort of regional champions. It's our job to shout up for our place, to bang on the door of Downing Street for support, to bang on the boardrooms of Shanghai and indeed of New York to get investment. And one of the best examples of that working, where the mayors came together when other politicians perhaps abandoned the field, was the case for HS2. The biggest infrastructure project ever in Britain, the biggest project in Europe at the moment, and it puts Birmingham right at the heart of the UK's future transport structure. And I'm pleased to say that it was the mayors who didn't worry about the political consequences, got forward and lobbied for that to happen. And as we all know, Boris Johnson, our Prime Minister, gave the go-ahead to that £100 billion investment just a few weeks ago. So the powerful voice of the champion. And then we've been getting on with that local transport infrastructure as well. If we say it limited productivity, there's what we've already done in the city here, but we're also incredibly ambitious. And that's the plan that we want to achieve. Before I'm accused of deception, it's not exactly comparable with the first map, because this has got local rail on as well, but it is comparable in terms of our metro, and you see the ambition. It's going to take us time, but the simple point is, why should we not aspire to what London already has? And it needs a sea change in the investment coming through from government, and that is following. And the really exciting thing is it's that infrastructure that's linking some of the toughest communities. So we talk about inclusivity, but if you are not connected to the transport infrastructure, you can't be connected to the job opportunities of the future. So that's the purpose of that infrastructure that we're working towards. So I hope what you take from that is we are getting on and addressing the 4 things that led to our decline. We're addressing them in a planful way going forward. And the good news is, it's working. I can't say it's worked, full stop. The thing is never over, but it's working, as this map shows. I showed you that for 40 years we've been the weak performer. This map shows, just before Christmas this was produced, and it shows the relative growth of different areas of the country. And you can see that the Midlands, the West Midlands, is bouncing back fast. Only 2 red blobs on that, London and us. So we are now right up there with the leaders, and I genuinely believe that what we've done has turned that around. And the final slide, it's difficult to see immediately what it's about, but it completes the journey. This is a block of offices in Birmingham The balloons have Economist written on them. You'll remember they were the newspaper that wrote that we were second city, second class. This picture was taken last year when they opened their office here in Birmingham. It was for their digital work, and that was the day I knew that we really had changed people's opinions, and most importantly, given opportunities to our new young people to work in a really progressive organisation like that. That's what it's all about, and I hope the conclusion that we all draw from this is the whole notion of regional economies can be motivated, can be driven forward in an inclusive way, and the key to the way to do it is to give power to local people. Yes, they exercise it through the ballot box, choose their directly elected mayor, hold them to account, but they also contribute to all of the plans that we've put together. And once London began to give us a little bit more authority, bit more freedom, and we'll push for more yet, that is when we've started to turn around our fortunes. Thank you very much for listening.